agreed with a sharp nod. Lucille, carrying her dress hem, walked beside him as he sampled this and that. Something about the man drew her in, and she found that she didn't want to leave his side. She had no notion of doing anything desperate. But Starr was the first man who'd impressed her since she'd learned her husband, Felton Thornton, had been killed in action. Of course, for all she knew, Starr may have been a horse thief. But the big man, with his deep voice, his single sparkling blue eye, his mysterious patch and slightly curled, overgrown brown hair, held her attention. Mrs. Lucille and sister are good enough. We aren't fancy folks, Captain. He laughed aloud and shook his head. Well, you two look mighty fancy to me. Sister had brought him a tin can to use as a glass, with a large shard of ice bobbing in the lemonade. We can sit over there. He nodded, spotting an open bench in the corner. But as the three began to move toward the seats, a scuffle broke out on the dance floor. They turned, seeing two young men standing chest to chest and eye to eye. As one of the men lifted his fist to throw a punch, the other swung his arm around the man's neck and threw his own weight down in an attempt to drop his opponent to the floor. Captain Starr sighed and made a face of impatient disapproval. Oh, no, Sister said. They're at it again. That's the Bledsoe boy and Alan's grandson, Thad. Won't the law stop them? Jack asked. Lucille shook her head. We have no law up here. Jack handed Lucille his plate and strode over to the boys. In a flash, he had both of them by the shirt collars, one in each hand, and, their boots hardly touching the floor, he rushed them toward the double doors. Open them wide, he said to some bystanders, and when Jack reached the top of the stairs, he hurled both of them out into the night. Now stay outside until you learn better manners. He returned, dusting himself off. Several folks offered their thanks, but he dismissed the act as nothing. I must apologize for those rude boys, Lucille said. Ah, boys'll be boys, he said with a wink, taking his plate back from her. Lucille steered the threesome to the far corner. They're old enough to be past that point, Lucille said. Then she turned to the crowd. Now, everyone, please let Captain Starr eat. He can talk later. Several people repeated his name aloud, and most shook their heads. They'd never heard of or met him before. Lucille felt pleased he'd lowered the boom on those two scamps, but she wanted to be protective of the stranger's privacy. He'd tell them his story later. At last, seated between the two women on the bench against the wall, he dug into the food, as if he were a starved wolf. No telling when he'd eaten last. But to Lucille's surprise, when the musicians started a polka, he handed Sister his half-eaten supper and took both of Lucille's hands. I haven't done this in years, so I might mash your toes. Let's polka. Lucille couldn't manage a single word before he whirled her away as if in a cloud of dust. She had to admit that he could dance, and it was all she could do to keep up. If he hadn't danced the polka in a long time, he sure had not forgotten how. Being whirled around in circles by a strong man was an exhilarating experience for her. She'd forgotten all the worrisome things that only a minute before had been weighing her down. Her breath came in gulps, and when the fiddles finally quit, he gave her a short bow that made her want to hug him. She straightened her skirt and told herself to mind her manners. At that moment, it seemed that everyone in the county was looking at the two of them. Later, he danced a waltz with Sister, spoke briefly to Eric Wheeler of the Bar 9, then returned to their section of the bench.